Hello, everyone. This is Sue Downey. Hopefully you can hear me. I am just hosting a little hosting duty tonight. We're waiting a little bit on Ruka, but I wanted to let everybody in so that we could get started as close to on time as possible. I know I value your time taking away on a weeknight. It's always hard. While we're waiting for Ruka to get here, I just want to say a big thank you to Adventure Nannies. So, as you know, the budget for at INA is often a little difficult, but this topic was so important to us. We wanted to make sure that we brought in speakers that were amazing and that would have a lot to say and be able to really dig in deep and get something out of all of these topics. And I went to Adventure Nannies, and before I could even finish asking the question, they said yes to me, because that's the kind of agency they are, and I so appreciate it. I want to read a little bit about them if you don't know about them. Adventure Nannies is a nationwide agency helping nannies, teachers, and newborn care specialists find long-term and temporary roles with innovative, progressive families across the whole United States. Adventure Nannies has received the Excellence and Innovation Awards from APNA in 2019, and they've been featured in the New York Times, CNN, Marie Claire, among others. They are passionate, and that really is the word to use, about creating education and empowerment among the candidates that they work with. They host Adventure Nannies, a weekly podcast for nannies, which is free and awesome, and you should be listening to, and also offer Summit Sessions, which is a quarterly educational series. The families Adventure Nannies work with are all willing to relocate for the perfect candidate and offer a minimum of $30 an hour with 40 guaranteed hours a week, benefits and assistance with relocation. And to learn more or browse their open positions, please visit adventurenannies.com. I cannot say enough good things about them, and we really appreciate their support and their willingness to help us bring this series to life. All right, I'm still admitting some people. I don't know what has happened to Ruka, so I'm going to text her. So sorry to do this. I'm sure it's some sort of technical thing. Sorry. But maybe this would be a great chance for me to let, oh, here she is. Here's Ruka. Sorry, everybody. Boy, we really will get used to this Zoom thing by the end of this, right? Like, I feel like I should be much better at it by now.
I'm so sorry, everyone.
There's Ruka. Thank you so much. We were just talking about Adventure Nannies. You haven't missed anything because you know they're awesome.
Yes.
I'm going to keep letting people in. Just a couple of housekeeping things, and then I'll turn it over to our lovely presenters tonight. We're going to keep the questions for the end so that the content can get shared in with time. So I'm going to stop everything a little before the end of the hour to give the Judy and Ruka a chance to answer questions. If you have questions, if you could just type them in the chat for me as you have them, we'll try to make sure that we get everything addressed. And if we run out of time, we can always address things via social media or with email or follow up with you in any way. Please don't hesitate to ask questions. I know this is a sensitive topic and we appreciate that, but the whole point is that we're here to learn. So we want you to know that this is a safe space where you can ask questions, and we are all coming at this in a spirit of sort of love and peace and being the best selves that we can be. All right, I think that's enough of me talking. I would like to introduce you, or actually to have them introduce themselves. Um, Judy Blair and Ruka Karate. Did I say it right?
It's curate.
Curate. I'm so sorry. You know, we talk to each other every week now. I should know how to
No,
pronounce your last name.
it's
Um, uh, Judy, I'm going to have you introduce yourself first, if you don't mind.
Sure, happy to. Hi, everybody. My name is Judy Blair, and I am a white woman living in Seattle. I use she and her pronouns, and I have been doing anti-racism work for about a decade. I specialize in working with white folks on anti-racism work, and my approach to that is very honest and compassionate. I am not interested in shaming anyone for where they're at around anti-racism, and I really love having conversations about it. So thank you to INA for asking me to do this, and thank you to Adventure Nannies for sponsoring it, and thank you to Ruka for agreeing to talk to me for an hour. And with that, I will let Ruka introduce herself.
Hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Ruka Curate. I'm in New York. I run Tiny Treasures Nanny Agency. I have been a nanny agency owner for 4 years, working with everyone. I love the fact that INA has allowed us to have this platform. Thank you so much, Adventure Nannies, for sponsoring this, because this conversation is important. And I am a she. Her, that's how I identify, and I am African American. This is mostly because I'm Nigerian, so I'm definitely African American. And I'm happy to have this conversation with you, Judy, and I'm glad that INA was able to give us this platform.
Sure. So, should we just dive right in?
I guess one of the places I do want to start, especially with everything that's going on now and what prompted having this conversation and many conversations like this by different organizations, is the Black Lives Matter movement, BLM, how diversity is really, really important, how people identify with each other. And I'm going to start off by asking, and Judy can definitely give me the right definition and her take, but what is BIPOC?
BIPOC. Yeah, this is an acronym that we've been seeing come up more recently. Folks might be familiar with POC, which stands for people of color, and it's a collective term that is used to refer to Black and brown people. BIPOC adds a B and an I on the front and stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And what it does is it really calls out the different experiences that Black folks certainly have in this nation, and that Indigenous folks, their experience has been in the United States, different from other groups of people of color. And you know, when Ruka and I were talking about this before, we were talking about, asking folks how they identify, and is it okay to even call someone Black? Like sometimes, like we don't know what the right words are sometimes. And so we were saying, like, really the best thing to do is ask a person,
Yeah.
right? Or, if you're online and an acronym or a name comes up and you're not sure about it, Google it. Go look, right?
Take a moment to Google it. Take a moment to really, first of all, it depends on the individual. So even with BIPOC, as powerful and strong as that acronym is, and as inclusive as it can be, it can also still be divisive, because all these groups, Black and brown people, we're not a homogeneous group. So putting us all in one place doesn't really work, because it's not about dividing. We don't want to continue to divide, because you could still talk about Indigenous people, and that's a whole different group of people by themselves. So like finding a way to like put us together is great, but it's always best to go to the individual and ask them, what do you want to be called? My husband is Black American. He's a descendant of slavery, and he wants to be called an American. He does not want to be called Black or colored. Please don't say that word. Don't ever call anyone colored. And he doesn't want to be called African American, because he's like, Ruka, you're African American. So just asking Googling and taking a moment not to be lazy about it.
Yeah.
And
I think that we have to get to a point where we realize that asking someone how they want to be referred to or how they identify is actually showing them respect, and right, asking them like who they are in the world. And we need to kind of get over that awkwardness about like, oh, do you identify as Latina? Do you identify as Black? Do you identify as African American? It's okay to ask those questions as long as they're coming from an authentic place of curiosity and wanting to get things right with people, right? As long as you're not trying to, like, I don't know, trap someone into some weird conversation about race,
yeah.
which would be weird.
I would skip that. But I love that we're talking about that, because I know this is a question a lot of people ask. They're often asking, like, well, she doesn't want to be called Black. Well, she doesn't want, there's just, you know, there's words that you know that you can't use. You can't use the N word. You can't, again, don't say colored, and don't find other ways to just not be nice when describing someone. And the same thing applies for any other race, but especially because, you know, African Americans, Blacks, Caribbean Americans, Latina dads, we're just really, really sensitive about how we're being described and like categorized in this world. And then it brings us to systemic racism.
Right, it does. Oh, look at you with your segue. All right. Yeah, so systemic racism. You know, this webinar today is about vocabulary. And so we, you know, we thought about what vocabulary was important for y'all to understand. And systemic racism is something that has been coming up in the news more recently when we talk about like defunding police or the demands of Black Lives Matter protesters and things like that. And so the question is, what is systemic racism? What does that mean? And so I want us to take a step back for a second. I always have to like use my hands for this one. So I like to start by talking about white supremacy, and that's the big one up here. So when I say white supremacy, sometimes folks think of the KKK, they think of guys with tiki torches in Charlottesville, they think of, you know, white nationalists, white power, right? They're white supremacists. White supremacy as a concept is just the idea that whiteness is normal, good, appropriate, something to strive for. And so it's this idea that being white is better than being a person of color or a Black person or an Indigenous person. And I think that, you know, if you have paid any attention, certainly to the fabric of society in the United States, you can at least agree that for the most part, there is this idea that whiteness is at least the norm. It is the normal thing. Like if we think of a doctor, very often we think of a white man. If we think of a teacher, we think of a white woman. If we think of a president, we think of a white man, unless we're pining for the only Black president we've had, right? And so thinking about whiteness as the norm is what white supremacy is. And then if we move a little bit further, I make this cone shape. So white supremacy is at the top of the cone. Underneath that is racism. And racism is the result of white supremacy. If you think that whiteness is the best thing ever, then you're going to think that non-whiteness is not, right? And so racism comes in from white supremacy. It's a result of white supremacy. And racism has all different kinds of aspects to it that I'll talk about in a second. But I want to take us down to like the bottom of the cone, and that is white privilege. And white privilege is a manifestation of racism. And so white privilege does not mean that white people have everything easy. It does not mean that we don't struggle. It doesn't mean that our lives aren't difficult. Mm-hmm. What white privilege means is that those of us who are white have not had a harder life because of the color of our skin. And so if we think about white supremacy, racism, white privilege, and how they kind of are all connected and all part of the same thing, then we can start looking at racism in context and start to understand that there is interpersonal racism, which is often what we think of as racism, you know, racist jokes, name calling, microaggressions. And if that's not a term that you know, hit the Google microaggression, you can find it. And so that interpersonal racism is what's very familiar to people as a concept of racism. But there is also institutional racism.
Yeah.
And that is racism that's expressed in policies in institutions. And when I say institutions, I mean anything from a small business to a club, to a church, to a government entity, to a bank. Basically anything that is an organization of people is an institution in this context.
And what's really important about that, and I love how you say that, is that when people think of systemic racism, you think of like, oh, the whole system is racist. It's this whole system is not racist. That's not what it's saying. It's saying that there are laws and policies that have been put forth since the abolishment of slavery that has not given and encouraged a more diverse workforce, neighborhood, education. And and I love to say this because I know there are, like, I have white friends who grew up really poor, like probably like poorer than I did. And they're like, well, I struggle too. I'm like, but if we went to the same job interview, they would look at you and look at me very differently, even if our application and our resume was exactly the same. And you wouldn't even notice it. Just even something based by what your name is. Like, I've never been discriminated because of my name, because it sounds foreign. People are like, oh, are you Russian? Like, my privilege is the way that I speak over the phone, right? Where there's not a lot of people who have that same privilege, and they have to attack things much differently and go about, like, if your name is like Shaquana, oh, she's automatically Black, she's not going to do a good job. You know, just these tiny little bits of microaggression that exist in our society is what is systemic racism. It's not that you guys are all racist, because you're not, hopefully.
Right. We're living with white supremacy, and white supremacy shows up in lots of different ways. So we've got institutional racism, which is like policies at individual institutions, right? And like sort of I hate to say favorite because it sounds terrible to have a favorite, like, terrible policy, but my favorite one to use as an example here is the US Navy only changed their dress code to allow Black women who are naval midshipmen, whatever, naval officers. Anyway, people in the Navy. Sorry, I apologize if you're military. I have no idea what all the words are. If you're in the Navy and you're a Black woman, they only changed their dress code in summer of 2018 to allow Black women to wear their hair in any sort of natural style. Up until July 2018, every Black woman in the Navy had to straighten her hair. That right there is institutional racism. And then we get to systemic racism when institutions start working together. And like Ruka said, it's not necessarily that people are like, ha ha ha, let me try to set up a whole system. Although, I'm sure there are people in back rooms doing all sorts of things. But systemic racism is when, like, for instance, here in Seattle, I know this is the case. I don't know if it's the case nationwide, but here in Seattle, if a student is truant from school for a certain number of days, they then get shunted into the judicial system and potentially into the carceral system, right? Just because they've missed school. And we know that the students who miss school the most are the ones that have the most barriers to getting to school, and those are usually students of color. And so that is a way in which these institutions work together, the judicial system and the school system work together to actually make a racist policy. And so when we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about policies, like Ruka said, that have been put in place really kind of a lot of times thoughtlessly. without any real understanding of how it's going to affect the people who have to live with these policies, or how it might disproportionately affect people of color. And the reason that we don't think about those things when we put those policies in place is there aren't enough people of color working in those decision-making positions to say, hey, wait a second, this is actually bad for my community.
Yeah.
Right. Ooh, that was a lot.
I mean, and I'm glad we're having this conversation, because sometimes people don't get a chance to really see how much it affects the African American, Black, BIPOC community, because it's not your community. So it's not saying that you don't care, it's just that you don't see it. And if you don't see how much it's affecting an individual, you know, your chances of really giving a flying fudge is pretty low. But now with the conversation going on with BLM, more people are being like, you're being flooded on your Instagram account and your social media account, and you're like, what is going on? I'm not racist. I hope I'm not racist. And it's just really about, and I'm glad Judy has these talks with people, but having these conversations with yourself and the people around you, and understanding that, you know, racism in housing, job discrimination, why Black women die during childbirth, why a lot of Black and brown people are dying during COVID. There are reasons why this is happening. It's not just because, oh my gosh, you know, most Black people are not taking care of themselves. That's not the truth. If you think about it, a lot of essential workers are mostly minorities. So they're being exposed to COVID, or they're going to the hospitals and the doctors are having to choose which life to choose. Am I going to choose this mom in her 50s who is white, or am I going to choose this African-American man who is in his 50s who is white? I mean, who is Black? I mean, this African-American man who is in his 50s, also the same age, Black. Like, they have to choose who to live, who's gonna live, who we're gonna give a ventilator to. And sometimes it's not even like they're trying to be racist, but at the moment it's like, I'm gonna save Miss White Lady. And those are the things we don't want. And we have to like get rid of bias, because that's the only way that we're gonna be there to do anything to be more anti-racist. And that's why we're going to go into anti-racism.
Yeah. So thanks, Ruka, for that too. I want to backtrack just a tiny bit about the effects of COVID that we're seeing on Black and brown folks, right? Like, yes, a lot of it is because the people who are our essential workers are lower income people, and we know that often maps on to racial lines as well. And we also know that COVID affects people who have other things going on with their health. And a lot of times, Black folks in particular, you know, there's a preponderance of high blood pressure in the Black community. And it's not because Black people are built to have higher blood pressure. It's that they are under more stress all the time than white people are. And so that high blood pressure is a comorbidity for COVID. And so because Black folks are living under the stress of racism, they are dying from COVID more often. And that is something that we need to talk about. We really need to talk about racism in healthcare, but we're here to talk about racism in general, and you all are nannies.
Healthcare and racism all day. That's a big topic.
Yeah, so we'll leave that one behind for another day, and maybe some other folks who are more keyed into healthcare statistics and things like that. But yeah, Ruka mentioned anti-racism. So a lot of folks are asking these days, how do I be anti-racist? And my answer to that question, if someone asks me that, I say, anti-racism is not an end state. You never like get the prize, you never get the diploma, I'm an anti-racist. Anti-racism, I see it as a continued practice. I have a practice of anti-racism because I can't do it all the time. Like, it's basically impossible to be anti-racist all the time, as much as I might try. there are too many ways in which it's ingrained in our socialization, in our enculturation, in our systems, that I can't be, it's impossible for me to be 100% anti-racist at every moment and every day that I'm awake.
So what can you do to, and this begs the question, if you're committed to, you know, making unbiased choices, or at least you're trying to, right? You start from, start from as little as you can do to the most that you can do.
Yeah.
And of course you're saying there's days that you can't do this. How do you check yourself? How do you like come back from that point?
Yeah, I think that we have to come to terms with the fact that it's never going to be done. Certainly not in our lifetimes. We are not going to live to see the end of racism. I really don't think so. I mean, I have a tiny bit more hope, given we feel like we're at a turning point right now that we haven't been at before in this country. But racism's big. It's been around for 400 years. And it's unlikely that any of us on this call today are going to live to see the end of it. And that can feel terribly overwhelming.
Yeah, that's kind of sad.
Yeah, really overwhelming and very sad, and can be paralyzing, right? Like, why even try? Especially because this Judy person is telling me I can't do it 100% of the time. Like, why even bother, right? And my answer to that is, we have to try. And the ways that we try can take many forms. We can march in the streets, as we've seen people doing, and we've done ourselves. We can pressure our elected officials. We can work from within institutions that we're a part of. If you are a part of a business or a church or a school, figuring out how to work from within in those institutions to make those institutions, their policies less racist, or their policies less racially disproportionate. We can work on our relationships with each other. Anti-racism is relational work. It involves knowing people and building trust with people and connecting on deep levels with folks. And we can also work on ourselves. We can notice when, you know, we've said something that maybe wasn't the greatest thing to say, or we have gone along with something, or we have stayed silent when maybe we should have said something. And just paying attention to those moments, noting them, thinking about what we could have done instead. And then when the opportunity comes up, doing it differently the next time is really a huge part of doing anti-racism work. Changing our behavior in response to racism is anti-racism work.
Makes sense. So being like, you're always fighting. We're always going to be fighting, even if we know we're not going to see the end of this battle or win this battle during my lifetime, hopefully my daughter's lifetime. There'll be different changes, but it's hard. I guess when something is worth fighting for, it's never easy.
Right. And if there were an easy fix for this, you know, folks in the 60s would have fixed it, and folks in the 20s would have fixed it, right? Like, folks in the 1860s might have even fixed it. But there is no easy fix for this, partly because we are looking at 400 years of history in the United States that makes it very difficult, and partly because it is so ingrained in our culture. When I'm working with clients, I do one-on-one coaching with white folks as part of my work. And when I'm working with clients, I really ask them to re-engage with empathy. And I think that, like, childcare providers in particular are maybe predisposed to that, right? You're dealing with people that can't always communicate with you about what it is that they need or want. And you have to sort of like put yourself in their place and figure out what's making this a bummer for this person, or what's making this great for this person. Like, why are they loving doing this thing that's annoying the heck out of me, right? That's engaging empathy. And if we can do that both with ourselves and with everyone else, then it makes it much harder for us to stand by when someone is being oppressed.
Yeah.
Or, it makes it much harder for us to stay silent when we maybe would have been in the past.
That's awesome. Would you tell me the difference between like being inclusive versus anti-racist?
Sure. Yeah. So inclusion is sort of a stop on the way to racial justice. And being inclusive means that you include people, right? Like that's sort of the dictionary definition. And the reason that it doesn't get all the way to racial justice is you can include people and still not be listening to them. And so inclusion is really important. Like you have to have folks at your table who have different experiences. You have to include those folks in order to be working towards racial justice. But if you're not listening to what they're saying, then all you have is inclusion, right? All you have is diversity. And what you don't have is equity. You don't have justice because you're not actually making any changes based on what they're telling you.
You're just partially listening?
Yeah. I mean, you might be saying, oh, yeah, okay, and then not actually changing anything. We do that all the time. We're like, oh, that's interesting. I'm just going to like keep eating my ice cream.
Goes to one of the questions in the chat that like popped out at me, and I want to get through some of these questions. And
Sure.
It's from Lisa. Lisa's like, how can Black people reach out to the white community to help bring about change without being labeled as complainers, angry, or ungrateful?
Oh.
Meaning what you just said was like, we can talk about these things. You can say you're being inclusive, but what are you doing about it? And if I have this conversation with you again in 6 months or a year or 5 years, you're just like, oh, well, I listened to this conversation already. We're doing the best we can. Are you doing the best that you can?
Right.
But how can we deliver our message without, the people who are in social media now, like, it's been 200 years, get over it. Oh, slavery was a long time ago.
Right.
I mean, it's
yeah. That is a tough position to be in. And especially because there is a tendency to sort of categorize Black folks in particular as being aggressive or angry, and Black women in particular as being aggressive or angry when they're just saying, yeah, you're not familiar with that at all, are you, Rika?
No, not at all.
When these Black women who are speaking and being called aggressive are actually just saying, like, hey, could you like it's like saying, hey, could you stop stepping on my foot? Yeah. And so that's a really difficult position to be in. And I don't know that I have an answer to that question. What I would say is, or what I will say, is that sometimes white folks will do this thing called tone policing, which is another Google thing, but I am going to talk about it, so you might not need to Google. So tone policing is when, like, say Ruka comes to me and she's like, hey, could you stop stepping on my foot? And I'm like, oh, you know what, your tone, you're sounding really angry right now, and that means that I can't really hear you, and I really need you to come back to me and be a little bit more civil, and then we can talk about the fact that I'm stepping on your foot.
Where it's insane because it's like, you're stepping on my foot. How do you want me to say that?
Right.
Like, how do you want me to deliver this message to you? And and that's really difficult because I know that I can come off, and I've been called an outlier before. You're not like them. You're not the same. And it's such a disrespectful way to talk to a friend or to talk to anyone. They're like, oh, it's not the same. You're educated. No, I don't think that means anything. Don't step on my toes. Don't step on her toes either. And for you, Lisa, honestly, I think the best thing to do if I were you, and this is just my opinion, is just to keep coming to the community and talking about what you feel like needs to be changed. Like eventually someone will listen. Like right now, people are listening. So go to those who will listen and won't listen no matter what. And as far as tonality, you're gonna have to listen in different ways. Like either I'm going to write you a letter or a text or social media or talk to you or, you know, protest. We're going to have to speak in different mediums in order for you to understand that this is no longer okay. Stop stepping on my toes.
Right. Yeah. I mean, thinking
Was that
about,
too aggressive?
yeah, that was really aggressive. I feel very threatened right now. Really glad that we're on opposite coasts.
Yeah.
So. But yeah, so I really would challenge the white folks that are on the call today. Like, see if you can spot yourself doing that. See if you can spot yourself doing that tone policing, or like sort of turning off when someone tells you something that you maybe are not comfortable hearing or haven't been challenged about before, or just seems angry and aggressive. Like, try to hear, like, obviously don't put yourself in like harm's way, and I'm not telling you to like remain in toxic relationships or anything like that. But if someone is telling you that they are being harmed by something, listen to them. And it shouldn't matter what their tone is when they're telling you that.
Yeah.
And if it's something that you can't do anything about, you can at least listen and say, I hear you. I hear that that is really hard. I'm going to try to talk to some other people who might know how to figure this out. And then actually go do that.
Yeah. I'm gonna go up through the questions, and I wanted to read Jennifer Lopez's question. She was just like, I'm Puerto Rican Latina. I get really upset when a survey for demographics asks if I am white or black.
Mm-hmm.
I am brown, and whenever I default to say I'm black, I am questioned because I look like I'm more white than anything. This bothers me also because it goes down to what you identify as and what makes you feel comfortable, and where there's not that check for you that's appropriate because you're like, I'm not one of these two,
Right.
but I'm going to select the black because that's what I identify with. It's really not fair for anyone else to tell you anything otherwise. One of these days, I feel like I'm just going to pretend that I'm a white girl all day and say that I identify as a white girl. And I want to see what people are going to say about that. I think the most important thing is just, again, looking, like having more categories is important, asking people what they identify as, and put in other or a blank that lets you sit there and say that this is what I am, this is how I identify. But that was a joke. I'm not white. I don't identify as white. I'm totally African American. Just in case someone comes later on and like asks, Ruka, you said I did. It was a joke.
Well, and it would be weird if you walked around saying that you identify as white, because white people don't say that. So
weird. Oh, look
right?
at that.
We don't talk about our race. We don't say we're white. Like, and some of us get like really like, oh wait, you're saying I'm white? Yes, I'm white.
What a privilege. You don't
yeah, I know.
Your race.
Right. We don't have to name it. We really don't. Those forms are the only times that we have to name it.
See, I learned something new.
Yeah, your mind just blew, right?
Yeah, I'm just insane.
Yeah.
Jacqueline Williams, do you have any information on racism in housing and communities? I guess this is one that, like, this is where Google will work, and mostly in your community. But I will say, before Judy gives you an answer, that you just really want to take the chance to like really do some research, especially when it comes to your community, because every neighborhood is different, every city, every municipality is different, and just really seeing what's available and how to notice when you're being discriminated, right? How do you notice if your landlord or a mortgage broker is not helping you out because of the color of your skin? And there's been a lot of people who will send a buddy who's white to go check if, you know, they're being discriminated. And I reporting these people is important because they need to understand that it's not okay. And I know Judy has a better answer for you because I don't know. You know, I'm just, you know, like she has a better answer because this is her world. But for me, I say that You won't know unless you do the research.
Yeah, I think that without having a ton more information about exactly what you're asking about, I mean, I would say, racial discrimination when it comes to housing is illegal
Mm-hmm.
in the United States and the whole country by federal law. And if you're experiencing that, it can be hard to prove, but reporting it will at least put it on someone's list somewhere at the government, so maybe they'll check it later. But it's the government and it works slow. So this does give me the opportunity, though, to talk about gentrification real quick. Which, yeah, so gentrification, is when white folks typically, well, no, I'm not going to say, I'm just going to say white folks move into neighborhoods that have historically been populated by people of color. And like we have that history of segregated neighborhoods in every city in the United States because of redlining. And redlining is a good Google opportunity. Because of redlining, we ended up with these segregated neighborhoods. What happens with gentrification is lower income white folks who still have a higher income than people of color get priced out of white neighborhoods. And so they start moving into neighborhoods of color. And that raises the property values because white folks are suddenly moving in, right? Stores and coffee shops and things like that, and restaurants start to open up that are trying to cater to those white folks, driving out maybe some long-term businesses run by people of color. And so we know what the process looks like. The thing about gentrification is that it is basically impossible to solve on an individual basis. Yeah. And so what we have to do to solve gentrification is look at policy. And we have to put pressure on people who write housing policy and really lend our voices towards more affordable housing being built. We have to lend our voices to support for small businesses run by people of color and other kinds of policy decisions that get made. But if you are a white person who has been priced out of the white neighborhoods, it can feel like you're being called a gentrifier, but really you just need to live somewhere. Yeah. And it can feel like just anxiety producing about that because you just need to live, right? And absolutely, you need to live somewhere. The thing is, we have to recognize that this is a process that happens. And it is, at this point, almost inevitable, right? That this sort of chain of destruction of Black communities happens once white people start moving in. And we have to, if we recognize that that is a thing that happens, that gentrification is harmful, then we can start thinking about what would it look like to not gentrify a neighborhood? What would it look like to have integrated neighborhoods that have multiple levels of socioeconomic class within them, right? Different options of places to live, not just all single family homes, not all apartments, but a mixture of both, right? We can expand our imagination to think about what that looks like. And if you are a white person who is moving into a gentrifying neighborhood, be a better neighbor to your neighbors of color, right? Like some of y'all may know about the Nextdoor website that is famous for, basically white neighbors reporting suspicious people on their street when it turns out they're just Black people who live there, right? So be a better neighbor, get to know your neighbors. And if you have a choice, consider not moving into that neighborhood. If you have a choice, with the understanding that you might not, right? Because of financial constraints. But if we just think about the ways that our own actions can affect the lives of others, we can start to see, those ripple effects, and we can maybe mitigate some of the harm along the way. So.
But it's also important that if you do move into these neighborhoods, I live in a very gentrified Brooklyn neighborhood, be ready to love us. If not, get out. Like, it's just that
right.
simple. Like, be ready to engage, be ready to be part of this community, be ready to be inclusive and anti-racist. If you're not ready to make those steps, then don't come, like just don't come. Like that's the one thing I will say, and it's not nice to say, but it's really important. And before I get really emotional about gentrification, because it's one of those things that I know I've been priced out of my neighborhood completely, because the closest house is like $2 million. I'm just, and and I will say this because it's not fair to some of the white neighbors that have moved here like 5, 10 years ago. A lot of them are just trying to find a place to live and
Right.
raise their children or be with their partners and like just live the best life. YOLO. It's not a place where you're like, they didn't come here to like, oh my God, I want the rent to go up significantly. They don't
Right.
want that.
Right.
And it's the system that's being created like, oh, look at all the white people lived in that neighborhood. They moved now. So you know what we should do? We should raise the rent on the people that couldn't afford it in the really, really expensive neighborhoods in the first place. You can't do that. It's not fair. And I'm not going to get emotional about it. Lisa, gentrification is not good, but you can make it better. I will say that
Yes.
by just doing everything that Judy said.
Just
And
follow my instructions
just do it.
and be fine.
And I think like before, like I know we have some time left and not too much time. As an INA director, as someone who believes in diversity and inclusion in the nanny agency arena, I want to answer and talk about Julia LaForce's question. Because she's like, most of the time when a Black nanny goes to a job at an agency, why do they get the high paying job just as a, why? Okay, so I'm assuming you're saying that why is it that Black nannies do not get the high paying jobs as white nannies? Am I right? I'm, I think I'm right. Because I've
Well,
had
let's ask that question.
a similar, like I've had this similar, yes.
Okay.
And I think that has a lot to do, not with the ages. I think I've been really, really lucky in this industry, at least the last year, where the nanny agency owners that I know believe in inclusion, equality, diversity. Like it's only a few of them that I know like this. I don't know all the other agencies, but the ones that I do know, like this is important to them. And it's important to me because I've noticed it as an agency owner that there are families that discriminate, and that's fine. And I will plug in Adventure Nannies, our sponsor, because a lot of this came from me speaking to Shenandoah and Krista who work there, and the importance and how important it is to them to have families understand that we're not going to discriminate. It's not about the finances, it's not about the money or the bottom line. It's really more. So there's a couple of agencies that I know that do not do that. Julia, that understands that if your experience is 10, 15, 20 years and you're an amazing nanny, you're going to get the same as your white counterpart. But what I do realize is that there are nannies who come, those from BIPOC backgrounds, that ask for less money than their white counterparts. I have a nanny now who has 6 months of experience that wants $35 an hour. And I have another nanny who has 18 years of experience that wants to just make a little over minimum wage. She's like, I'm just happy if I make $700 a week. So it's a mindset that needs to be worked on to make people understand, especially as women, because we're already paid. I mean, we're already underpaid, to understand what our worth is and to also work with agencies that represent us to the full extent that they can. I know that I place Black nannies and white nannies who pretty much make the same, because I'm a Black woman. I'm not gonna have it. It's just not going to happen. And I'm hoping that other agencies are the same way. I know that our sponsor is. Thank you. I'm glad you're sponsoring us, Adventure Nannies. And I know that there's an amazing agency in Boston that is. There's another one in Philly that is. There's another one in California. Those are the only ones that I know that really understands that it doesn't matter if you're Black or white or blue or green. If you're good at your job, you're going to get what you're asking for.
I'm going to jump in really quick, because I see some amazing agency owners who are on this call. And so if you're looking for an agency that obviously has this at heart, Obviously, some of our agencies are here. Feel free to drop
Ryan,
your name.
Wendy, I don't know anyone else. Who else is here that I love?
I see Ryan, I see Wendy. I'm sure
Yeah.
there are more. Feel free. I think shout out to any agency owner who's giving up free time to come to this. And I say put your
Everyone.
Hi, Ruka. I'm in Phoenix and Dallas and Denver.
Oh yeah. Hi. I'm sorry. I don't know everybody. Judy, I wondered if you could another buzz sort of thing I keep hearing, and I think that sometimes it was by me misinterpreted, is the idea of unintentional bias. Can you tell us what unintentional bias is?
Yeah, it's often referred to as implicit bias or unconscious bias, and that is bias that can be either positive or negative. That is something that we don't even know we haven't spotted it, right? And so unconscious bias is the sort of thing that like Ruka was talking about earlier, you know, if you're looking at resumes and one name is quite obviously someone from the Black community, very often unconscious bias will mean that the hiring manager for that job will just toss that resume. It's also unconscious bias that will make non-Black folks feel like Black folks are being aggressive or threatening when they're actually just walking down the street or just asking them a question. It's something that's it can be really hard to combat or mitigate. It's the kind of thing that you have to be very vigilant about. Yeah. And you know, we'll never get rid of all of our unconscious bias. It's part of our, it's part of the limbic system. It's part of the lizard part of our brain that tells us whether we should run away or not. And so, you know, biases keep us safe in a lot of ways. Like when we are driving a car and something runs in front of us, hitting the brakes is part of our bias system. So it's useful to us in a lot of ways, and we won't ever get rid of it. It won't ever be not a thing that is part of the human brain. But what we can do is try to start noticing it when it comes up, or be in a relationship with someone who can tell you, hey, I think your bias is showing. You know, and whether that's someone you work with or a friend or a partner or whatever, someone who can point it out to you, because once it's pointed out, you can try to start to recognize it yourself. Yeah, it's the unconscious bias is some tough stuff, because it's like everything else, it's so ingrained in us. So
I love where this conversation is going, and I love how everyone is just so, you guys have some really good questions, and you're really trying to, are they being anti-racist? Is that where we're going first, having these conversations and just trying to figure out what your next steps in life when it comes to BIPOC and others. I'm gonna say others because again, there's groups of people that don't want to be called BIPOC. Also, you just, again, circling back to the top, you just have to ask. But when it comes to, I know Jennifer is asking about jobs. Jennifer, apply to all these amazing agencies up here, especially those who are here. There's some that I'm pretty sure they have other reasons why they can't be here, but it's important, they're taking the time to hear this conversation and learn more. So this is something that has to be important for them. At this point, I'm hoping that they're listening and they're going to take in, right, Judy? Listening, we don't have to have conversation a million times.
Totally.
So try your best to just fill out agencies, but there's some really, really great ones who understand why this conversation is so important. I'm hoping Judy comes back and has this conversation with us again, because it's bigger than just us. It's larger than us, and we need to be able to just be ready to have more of these conversations. Yeah, look at Kim. Kim was just I'm not BIPOC. See, and that's why you ask.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. I see there's a note from Jennifer about being told that her approach when taking care of children is white. is a white approach. Jennifer, I really encourage you, if you have access, and maybe Shenandoah, I saw you on this call, so maybe you can maybe provide access. I did a summit session with Adventure Nannies, was it a year ago now, I think, where I talked with Danielle from Adventure Nannies about white cultural norms. And we went through a whole list. There's a list of 15 of them. But if you can find that, that video of that conversation, that might be really helpful when thinking about your approach to childcare, and not saying that whatever you're doing is wrong by any means, but white culture informs everything that we do. And there are different ways of doing things. So I would encourage you to look for that if it's available. I think it might be on my website. I should know that.
Jennifer, if you get in touch with me, I can get you into the, it's still in the, I can get you that information.
And also, Jennifer, I think it's important that any family you work for, you sit down in the beginning of the job. It's going to take some time. You know, there's this huge period of acclimation when dealing with new families and children, and ask them how they want things done. Not saying that you should completely change your approach, but the way I may want my daughter raised is very different than someone else. So taking, whether it's Black or white, taking the time to ask, like, what is your disciplinary style? How do you guys want, like, you have to, as a nanny, I think one of the most important things is to be able to adjust to the parents' parenting and learning and disciplinary style. If you're unable to do that, it makes you very rigid in your approach, and it can also make it very hard for people to see your values because it doesn't align with theirs. And I know there's a lot of nannies up here that can speak to their own experience, but for me, I've worked with so many families as a nanny before, nanny agency owner, and I took the first couple of weeks asking them, how do you want this done? How do you want this done? How do you want this done? Not because I wasn't proactive and I couldn't do my job. I just didn't want to disrespect anyone. And it, like, as a Black mom, it could come off disrespectful if you're not taking the time to get to learn how I want my child to be raised. It's hard, but it just takes a few extra steps. And other nannies can chime in and say if I'm wrong, but I think that's the best approach to dealing with different families.
All right, so it is 8:56, so I am going to try to wrap this up. We could obviously go for much longer, but hopefully this has given us some things. We have some things to Google, like redlining and microaggressions. Write yourself a note right now. If you don't know what those are, that's your homework to continue the journey, right? Feel free to reach out to me, Sue Downey, through the INA office, or just directly through Nanny Palooza or whatever. You can reach out as well to Ruka, who's also a board member, and I see Krista Nader, and there may be other board members. I think Rachel was on. We want to hear from you. We are going to continue the conversation about diversity and racism through several upcoming webinars. So keep connected to us. I want to thank Judy so much for your time and expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
So helpful to have somebody come in and help us digest all of this so that we can be on the same page as we try to have these conversations. And I really appreciate your time and willingness to do that with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I learned a lot from you.
I did.
Google.
This is my favorite one from tonight. You can include them without listening to them. And I was like, oh, that I never really thought about that exactly that way before, because I've always include, but that doesn't always mean that I'm listening.
Yeah.
So that's my post-it note for tonight.
Yeah, I like that quote.
Yeah, I like, that was a good little nugget. I want to end with, I got a beautiful email from my friend Teresa Hoy, who's on the call tonight. And it's actually going to be a blog post, I hope, from the INA blog, talking about her experiences and racism and some things. And the point at the end of it was that we have to remember that that racism is taught, that we're not born this way, that racism is taught to us and handed down to us through so many things. And the happy part of that to me is that anything that you learn, you can unlearn. So that's like a hope for me, that I can unlearn the things that have been taught to me. So I appreciate all of your time here tonight. Please keep the conversation going. Please know that you can reach out to us at any time.
Yep.
And this will be recorded. If you want to listen to it again, it'll be up on the YouTube channel for INA. So thank you so much.
And thank you everyone that showed up. I really appreciate your time and listening. And hopefully that you take this. And Sue, thank you for organizing this. I really appreciate that. I don't think we've said thank you to you, but you did this. So thank you so much.
It is my pleasure.
Yes.
Thanks for coming, everyone, tonight. Have a safe and healthy tomorrow, okay? Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I
Bye.
appreciate you all engaging in this work.
Okay, Libra.